There's been warnings, errors, or exceptions that dealing with being a sysadmin. Just want to talk about when dealing with the warnings as the role. We have things that deal with ATMs that come in with transactions. And there's been one evening where we have a role that we do while we're on call once a week, and transactions come in, and when queues build up over time, we have to monitor this stuff. And we have a manual process that we look at, and when this queue gets over the limit in time, it's kind of difficult to monitor these processes. Thing about it is there has to be a way that we can automate these processes rather than doing it manually. And that's what we're kind of trying to look at. So if you're like me, somebody that has anxiety, sometimes when you look at errors like this, sometimes you can freak out. So we try to avoid things like this. And which leads me to the title of this presentation, SQL Statement Data Gathering. So why should you care about this? The thing about it is you may not, with your roles in computer or in IT, you may not have anything to do with ATMs, transactions, or anything like that. But the thing about it is they're not really difficult processes to do, but the thing about it is if you can kind of look at these processes and how to go about it rather than connecting to databases directly. There's things that in our environment, people try to do things like, for example, web scraping, go about getting to their data differently, where there's easier ways of doing it, especially from an operations standpoint. It's easier if you have access to the source. For example, going directly to the database. And that makes things a lot easier if you have that sort of access. Another thing is, what I think is, when I started using PowerShell, I used to create a lot of PS1 scripts. And there's nothing wrong with it if it's just a few lines, but now I rarely ever create PS1 scripts. Almost anything I create, especially if it has multiple lines, I create modules for readability, testing, things like that. I know I got a lot more I can learn from PowerShell, but anymore I create modules. And a lot of people in my or in the company that I work for, they don't create modules. But if we can kind of lead people in that way, I think that we can be better off to kind of get people learning more of how better create scripts for their PowerShell. For the agenda, I'm going to look at Linkscape automation and how we got to this and how we work towards it. The SQL Server module, which comes from PS Gallery, and the ITOps verification module that is custom built, and a demo. And okay, I thought we missed a slide, but there, this is me. So I got a little worried there. I thought we missed something, but this is me. I work at Teachers Credit Union as a system administrator. There's the QR code for Teachers Credit Union. We're a bank that is in the region of Indiana and southern Michigan. So usually if you're not in that area, you may not have heard of us. And there's LinkedIn QR and my Twitter account. Just to let everybody know that I'm also a big Star Wars fan, so if you see any references to Star Wars in these slides, that's probably why, just to be forewarned. There's a GitHub repo where I'm going to put all the slides at. And here's just give recognition to Teachers Credit Union because they so generously helped pay my way out here to the PowerShell conference. System administrator role, they play, just kind of go through these fast because they kind of wear a hat with many roles. Usually level 2 support. If something's like more, needs a little bit higher level, we pass it on to engineers level 3, but usually we pretty much do a little bit of everything, where it's networking, applications, processes, databases, a little bit of everything. But one of the main things we do is monitoring, whether it's ICMP, ping, monitor ports, applications, things like that. The thing about ATMs is we can ping the ATM, monitor ports to make sure things are up. But what if people aren't getting their transactions? We can make sure people are getting their transactions or the money, but even though ATM is up, we can ping it, the ports are up, doesn't mean that it's working. For example, there's a queue. Say, for example, like if the queue is building up and it's pingable and the port is pingable or open, I should say, it could still be down. One example is if we're doing upgrades, right? So one night when it was doing an upgrade, it's down, and had to follow up, see what's going on, and this other sysadmin said he was doing an upgrade, but once we figured that out, the upgrade was finished, and the queue started going back down again. So that's one example, but that's okay. But there's, for example, if it was not the case, then that's an issue that we got to look at. So what we're looking at is transactional data, which is data in the database that we look at. For example, if that queue is building up, that data is in the database we just got to get to. So the problem that we're looking at is monitoring ATM transactions. Possible solutions is, I'm sure everybody has any third-party utilities that you can look at. One possible option was Automate that we have, which is basically a third-party utility. It's like a scheduler that has their own scripting language. The thing about it is that we're not really, we use it mostly for FTP, moving files around. And we don't have a license for the PowerShell part, but there's always ways working around that. But I didn't really want to go that route with Automate, since we mostly use it for FTPs type stuff. We monitor things with solar winds, and we could use PowerShell for that. Usually the things we do with SQL with that is, monitoring. If you send an SQL query, usually you get a true back if it succeeds and a false back if it fails. But it's not like getting the data back that you'll want. There might be other advanced stuff you can do with it if we have that, but that's not my knowledge extent with the SolarWinds SQL stuff. And then we have UiPath, which is kind of funny because that we have UiPath because the other day I was just walking around town in Seattle and I just noticed that there's a UiPath sign up. So I don't know if that's their headquarters or something, but I thought that was kind of humorous. But we have UiPath, and they do a lot of window scraping and REST API type stuff. And but we have a whole department that does RPA, but didn't go that route. But then we have PowerShell that we can just connect directly to the database. Not saying we couldn't use these other tools, but at the time, PowerShell was just the easiest way to do things. Now here's the Linkscape interface. This is the interface that takes care of all the ATM transactions. As you can see, there's like a device ID, which is ID to each interface. And then there's an SNF queue. You see the 7 there. Well, that's the queue that we got to monitor. Usually, the higher that goes, that means transactions are building up. And if that gets high, well, that can get high, but you don't want to get too much high. That should always be changing. It only takes a few seconds. We have a refresh button. So what we're usually doing each evening as on call, we'll log in, look at that queue, and click the refresh button. Obviously, like UiPath could like just window scrape this thing. But usually we have access to the database where we can just go in and look at the data logs and things like that. Now, SQL Server, there's really not too much to it. It's just in PowerShell or PS Gallery. You just install it, import it to your session, and you just use the command that invoke SQL CMD. And we'll take a look at that in the custom module that we built. Now here's the ITOps verification module. As it contains the Linkscape command list that we built. And I have an internal repository that we built. So it's install module, ITOps verification, import module. And have a little short demo. Hopefully this will go okay, because trying this for the first time, it's a utility seen on Slack that somebody else posted. Should make it easier than just typing everything out, so we'll see how it goes. So basically just do get PS repository to look at the one. So we have PS Gallery, but the PowerShell internal repository is just PS or PowerShell repository. So we have, we just install it, import it, which imports into your PowerShell session. Oh, sure. Let's see if we can do that. I can figure out how to do it here. There we go. See if I can do it better. I had it going there. There was a little better. Yeah. So there we go. We did that imported to your PowerShell session, and there's all the functions or modules for the ITOps verification. We won't go through each one, but most of them are for the interfaces for Linkscape. So most of them, once you see one, they're all the same. They're just going to a different interface, basically. So, and that's just the end of this short demo. The main demo is towards the end. We'll see more. But let's see here. I just gotta find my mouse. Okay, schedule tasks. We have a scheduling server. So all I did is basically schedule the task. Now, I wrote this script like 4 years ago. So like most people, when you write a script, and then many years later you look back, it's like I could have wrote it much better now that I know more than I did back then. So, so anyway, this is a PowerShell script, just in a scheduled task, is just executing a PS1 script. Now that I know more now, I would have probably done it in a module, but it's pretty simple. So going on, here's the scheduled task general tab. Redacted some of the information for security reasons. Since it's a bank, I had to be careful what I can and can't show. So the thing is, there's a service account here, and there's some pitfalls we run into that I learned that you need to use a service account for password reasons, because it needs to be, you don't want your password expiring, so use a service account, and you got to make sure that you have read permissions to the database in order to get that information back. Okay, Linkscape service account. Just put in some generic data here. Of course, stump.locals domain name. This is one thing that I've had to remind people where I work is the Bruce, this is a long username, just a funny generic name, is the new logon format. The Bruce, this is a long user, is the short naming format in Active Directory. You gotta be aware of that because some people, when you create an Active Directory user account, that a lot of things use the old naming format. So if they're using the new naming format, which might be over 20 characters, and they're saying, I can't log in because it's saying wrong username or password, it's because they probably need the short name. So then you just gotta say, instead of using Bruce, this is a long username, you gotta use Bruce, this is a long user, or the short version of whatever that is. So which the short name goes with the SAM user account. So, and that's my team's picture with Wookiee. So, but if you look at the Active Directory in PowerShell up there, it's same thing as the SAM account username. So, and then the invoke Linkscape status. This is the PS1 script, which is pretty simple. Back then, I didn't do much splatting, but this might be a good case where you could use that here. But basically, it's just creating variables that sound email. And then the mail Linkscape status report is basically just invoking a PowerShell script. One thing I had issues with is it creates an array. So I had to output it to a string because the array made the email look all messed up. I wanted the email to look really decent. So I just output to a string. And here's one example of that. So I used a getType function just to show you that when I first did it, it was an array. The email looked messed up, so I just converted it to an outstring or to a string object. It could look a lot nicer. That's one thing I love about PowerShell is I'm constantly changing things from one object to another. Makes it very simple to do that. Another thing you got to be aware of when you're doing the process like this is when you're in a PowerShell session, you got to import it. But when you're doing making a process, you got to make sure you put it into your profile. Now, I didn't mention it earlier, but I have PowerShell 7.3 on my desktop. But we use, in our server environment, we use the PowerShell that comes with our servers, which is Windows 5.1. So you got to be kind of aware of that, which is Windows PowerShell. But if you're doing Windows PowerShell 7.3 or 7.x or whatever that is, then the profile folder will be just PowerShell. So, and then in your profile, that is, instead of, or that's where you would put your imports. That way, when the process logs in, those modules will already be available to you. Here's your Linkscape status output that I showed you in that PS1 script. All it's basically doing is just executing each module. It's basically just as simple as that. And then when we go to, this is the only module that's really different than the others. Once we get to the others, it's basically all the same. So here, just a module. We're just creating two variables, none, because if they succeed, then it's just going to be none. But if there's error, then we're going to put the data into it. So basically we're executing that invoke SQL command with the database server and query. And the nice thing about PowerShell is, even though I know something about SQL, I really didn't even know much about the SQL, because when we did this, I was talking to my manager, and sometimes when he goes to look at this data, he goes into the database and looks at this stuff on the back end because it's faster than going through the web GUI. And sometimes when there's issues, instead of like doing refreshes and waiting for it to come up, he'll just go to the database and do a quick query, and he was showing me one day. So what happened was he was showing me the query, and he already had this SQL built. So I didn't even have to write any of this SQL. I just thought, well, he already had SQL, and he gave me or showed me the SQL. All I had to do is write the PowerShell script around it. I just had to add the SQL to it. So not that it didn't take a while to write, but I didn't have to do any of the SQL stuff. I just had to understand it. So I just added the SQL, make sure it made sense. And the thing about it is, the only really important stuff is that we have the date, because is for the last 24 hours here. As you can see, dash 1, which is last day. And because we want the last 150, anything over 150 records, because that means anything that's more than 150 in the queue. Because that's in the links gate where you've seen that 7, that's how many are in the queue building up. So that's the important thing, which is in that if statement. Links gate data.count greater than 150. Then we just put in a for each statement, and then now we're looking at the operation date time, that anything that's in there for over 24 hours. So basically we're just looking for anything in the queue that's over 150 in the queue, or in the next links gate data for each object, anything that's in there for over 24 hours, because we're looking at two things, over 150 in the queue or older than 24 hours, because they should not be in there that long. And then this is the second part of that script. So, and then depending on what it does, we just put them in those variables. And then we're just creating a here string. That way we know what to output. Okay, and here's a sample email is what we should get. Here, linksgate status would be 9, none. For the 150, an error, none. That's if everything works out okay. The one on the right would be like an example if there was an error. So, of course, linksgate error for over an hour means that everything's good because it's none. But the warning above it with over 150 in queue means there's an error issue, but with 253 in the queue. Okay, now we're looking at the interfaces. These, they're basically all the same, so these should go pretty fast going through. But the thing about it is, the key about it is the date and the device ID. So here, the date is over than 5, because if you look at the date diff there, it's over 5 days, but device ID is 82, because each interface has a separate device ID. And then at the bottom, we're invoking SQL command and querying that here string, which is SQL, looking for that device ID. And here's the XP host interface. We're looking at device ID 4 greater than, well, here it's older than 15 days. It all kind of depends on what we're looking for, but basically we're just looking for, depending on the date, and we might do ascending or descending, depending on what we're looking for, and how old it is. So we're just doing that for each interface. And then we're just invoking it and outputting it to this output there. And then here's the other interface. Here is device ID 80, greater than 15 days. And here's this one, device ID 105. And all these are pretty much the same, just walking through them. This one's device ID 103, greater than or the last 15 days, within the last 15 days there. Same thing here. So it's a pretty simple process once you get going. And here's the sample emails that we're outputting. Of course, these are all 4s, but it could be communication error. There's a lot of different errors, and we'll look at those from the database table. And this is a table where you get the description of if it's successful or not. And of course, 0 is undefined. But here I'm just using invoke SQL command to look at the device type in the database table. And for notifications, this is a thing. For a while, we used to get text messages, and then that became an issue with, I'm not sure what happened, if it was some policy or something that stopped us from getting text messages within our environment. But then we just started manually logging in, doing this manually. But then when we started using PagerDuty, which made it a lot better. So with PagerDuty, not only do we get, actually we get push notifications because we have an app on our phone. And basically it sends an email to PagerDuty and when there's an alert. And PagerDuty sends us a push notification. That push notification there's different ways it can alert us. It can send us a push notification. It can call us on the phone. It can send us a text. It can send us an email. There's a lot of different things it can do. And then not only that, if we don't respond, what it does is it can wait 5 minutes and send it to us again. If we still don't respond, we have like a backup person, then it sends it to that person. And depending on how we have it set up, it might send it to them again. If that person doesn't respond, then it may send it to our manager, which is good because then we know somebody's going to respond if there's an issue. Okay, look at a demo here. Now, when I started doing this, I did it we're really limited to what we can and can't put on our laptops for security reasons. So it's not like I can put a database on my laptop. We use SQL Server, so I was like, well, I can go get MySQL, free MySQL instances in the cloud. So I did it in MySQL, and it's like a week before this conference, they decided to do an upgrade. It wiped all my databases and stuff off MySQL. So I'm like, gosh darn it. So I'm like, well, is there a way I can do this in PowerShell? So I actually was able to create the database and everything in MySQL, not even worry about a connection to the cloud or anything. So I thought that was kind of neat. Maybe if we have time, we can kind of take a look at that. But let me see if I can expand this a little better. There we go. Okay. Here we're just installing the PowerShell demo. Here's all the functions for it, and we're going to see here. Okay, we're importing the data into the the operations database. Originally, I wrote this for Windows 5.1. I was able to actually didn't have to do anything to make it work in 7.3. I just tried it in 7.3 and it worked. Here's all our data. Let's see here. I don't know if I can scroll up. It's a little difficult when I'm looking on a different screen. There we go. Here we have the response type. Oh, we can get it smaller. There we go. Yeah, that's all our data. And sorry about that. It's kind of hard to see, but there's actually 151 records there. So anything over 150 means there's going to be an issue. It's just not showing up really nice. Here we're updating the device log. Basically just updating the database so that we can actually execute on the transactions. Okay, here's the other database. We need the transaction logs. And as you can see, these are all the device IDs here. No, these are the device IDs, and these are the error IDs, or status IDs. And instead of creating actual data table for the status IDs, I just did it quicker. I just created a hash table. But basically, we're looking at the status types, which is the ID, which corresponds to the description of what each ID stands for. Okay, this is when we send an email. This is what the first module is doing. So we have Linkscape SNFQ is 151 with the second warning and the errors. And then here's an example of one of the interfaces that did. So the next one should do everything all together instead of going through each interface. I did one that'll just do it all together. And this is everything all at once. Kind of hard to see this, but yeah, and there's the first part of the output. And just got to find my mouse here. And call action create modules instead of PS1 files because it's so much better and makes things more organized, better to test. And consider using PowerShell to connect to databases rather than using third-party utilities because it's more efficient. Sometimes it's just better than going the other route if you're using web scraping, whatever that is. Had one other thing really quick I wanted to show real quick. And I would kick myself if I didn't show it. Or this might make. Here's this Linkscape demo top process that just kind of shows the transactions coming in real time. It's a test. There we go. That might be easier to see. But you can see the processes coming in. Test member numbers, amount, operation ID, all the same data that we would have in production, but this is all in test within PowerShell. And if anybody's interested, with the code, I was able to create database tables using, I use hash tables and PS custom objects a lot. And of course, creating a database in PowerShell obviously isn't good for production instances, but if you ever need something to use for test, or maybe there might be something to look at for using another data type that maybe you want to see if it'll work better in a hash table or a PS custom object or something like that. This really worked well for me. It's new object, system data, data table. If that's something you might want to look at, it really worked well for me. Just putting that out there. And that's all I got. Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to get a selfie, so real quick. All right, thank you. Yeah.